Well, hello everybody. Как поживаете, which means how are you in Russian. My name is Ralph Schultz. I'm broadcasting from New Mexico, United States of America. Today is January 18th, 2022, and welcome to video number 6 in my YouTube channel series about Russia, the United States, in the history and leading up to the current conflict. Today, we're going to talk just about the Ukraine, and it's a hot topic today, and I devote quite a few pages in my book to talking about the Ukraine. Here's a look at the size of this country. It is huge. It's at least 400 miles wide. So there's a lot of difference between the western and eastern Ukraine, as you can tell, and it's really a pathway from Europe into the heart of Russia. Okay, so Russia, I'm going to talk for a couple minutes here about what's going on, and then we'll get into the pages 82 to 87 of the text. Russia, is doing everything to prepare for a massive attack to take the entire eastern half of the Ukraine, including Kiev, in front of our own eyes. We just can't decide, but it's doing everything which would lead one to believe it's going to happen. I'm not saying it will happen. It might be the biggest fake out in the world. And NATO is going to let the Ukraine get destroyed to prove a point of principle of the rule of law and the international liberal democracy should always be the guiding principle. And incidentally, Russia is just sending home most of its diplomatic employees, all the women and children in buses, and just keeping a skeleton crew at their main embassy in Kiev and some of their consulates. That's not a good sign, is it, for peace? So, the status quo continues on. There's a bunch of meetings last week. There's still some Blinken and Secretary Blinken and Secretary Lavrov are going to have a meeting here next day or two, but there's an impasse. Ukraine, is never going to go to NATO, according to Russia, and that's been declined already by NATO. They're never going to agree to that, and that's the main issue here. And the U.S. has talked about making some concessions if Russia would pull back some of its troops. They're minor things, in essence, compared to the Ukraine-NATO issue. Reduction in training exercises involving Ukraine, pulling back some of their incursions near Soviet airspace and at sea and on land, and bringing missiles further back westward and further distance from Russia, things like that, and then doing a mutual treaty for the reduction or control of nuclear weapons. Okay. What's Russia doing? They're pulling in more and more troops from the eastern regions of the country in Asia. And a lot of these, what used to be called Katyusha rocket launchers, these are artillery pieces that you've seen that fire quite a few explosive rockets. Some of them explode with napalm. There was a recent cyber attack. 70 Ukraine government sites were attacked. And some of them, the final phrase was, "Be afraid, expect the worst." So USA intelligence says Russia is setting up a false flag to justify an intervention in Ukraine. Special forces, special ops troops in small amounts were seen in Kiev and around Russia. And these are especially trained in urban warfare and explosives, to set up a fake attack on the Russians, and then the Russians blame the Ukraine, justifying an attack. Okay, what I consider this is to be a slow-moving attack. It's a hybrid warfare at its best, and it looks like some type of aggression is underway as we speak. Okay, we don't know how far it's going to go. Will the Ukrainian current government get toppled and a more Russian-friendly government be put in? Who knows? Remember I said last week, Putin is emotionally invested in Russia. It's not just him as a leader and so on. His two uncles were killed in the siege of Leningrad by the Nazis. His mother was killed, shot by the German army, and his younger brother died of diphtheria when he was an infant in the siege of Leningrad. These are in the early 1940s, that horrible siege. So he has that to influence him. And also, by the way, believe it or not, his grandfather was one of the main cooks, like a chef, for both Stalin and Lenin way back in the 1920s. So you can see how closely emotionally invested he is in Mother Russia. Okay, and just today I saw on some news channels a Democratic U.S. senator piped up and said, "We must protect the sanctity of democracy." So you can see the Western viewpoint on this international liberalism. And the Senate is approving sending more lethal offensive weapons, including Stinger missiles, which are these handheld things on your shoulder that fire a rocket and can take down nearby aircraft and helicopters. And the Afghans use these to fight against the Russians. They're supplied by the U.S. in the 1980s, and some other equipment. Germany has stated, we're going to back Ukraine. Canada is sending in some equipment and some troops, backup troops, to do things, away from the combat areas. And not to be outdone, the United Kingdom is sending 600 soldiers over there. Again, they'll be kind of in a backup support position of one sort or another. So you see how this is taking off. And right now I'm going to show you a picture of Victoria Nuland choosing the Russian or the Ukrainian Prime Minister in February of 2014 after the Russian favored government was toppled. It was a coup, some say. Maybe I agree with it, you'll find out. But you can see this is not a fake. The Yatsenuk is right there, the first man in the group of three. That it was like a beauty contest. And she's talking to Jeff Pyatt, the U.S. ambassador, and she's a diplomat, about who to choose for the next prime minister for 3 months before they have a major election. Clear evidence I've never seen. So here it is, and this is, I think on page 84 or 5 in my book as well, somewhere in there. Take a look. Okay, and here we're going to start on the book. I know some of you want to drop off now. It's nap time as I read this, but those of you who do listen to this will be empowered. Knowledge is power, as I tell my students. And you won't have to buy the book, although it wouldn't hurt to buy the book or become a subscriber. And then if you send me your email through the email that has been posted, and it's confidential, and then I will send you an electronic draft copy of the book, which you can send to other people, in which it's not an ebook, but you save it and read it at your leisure. It's living color. Okay, everybody? So get your books out, the one or two or three of you who might own one, and we're going to go to page... Why is it so hard to find things sometimes, huh? Yeah. I'm going to repeat a little bit of the last one. I summarize on page 78. I want to make sure this sinks in. To summarize, this is Russia's new attitude. Russia's perception of the imposition of destabilizing Western political liberalism into Russia in an aggressive military NATO expansionism, combined with the new U.S. policy that considers Russia an enemy and a second-class country, has resulted in new Russian defensive policies and encouraged the rise of Russian nationalism, it sure has, and a return to imperialistic Russia, glory in international respect and influence, which is what they're trying to achieve, and they are, if you consider the entire world. These policies include supporting right-wing movements in Europe and the USA, advanced cyberspace capabilities, political support of Russian minorities in former Soviet republics, rebuilding a strong modern military, and they certainly have one, and the building of a nationalistic unified state with limited managed democracy and a strong economy. The Kremlin admits Russia is different from liberal democracies, and their economic political model, that is the Russians, is just as legitimate as that in the U.S., the United Kingdom, and Germany. Russia is not going to duplicate them or move in that direction. Many of its citizens feel the same. I have heard them interviewed on the internet. I thought it was interesting to hear Russian leadership say they have a tightly controlled, centralized state and be very proud of that heritage. Sure, there is Western democratic liberal movements there, but mostly that's concentrated in Moscow and Leningrad, and with the more highly educated elite. Okay? So the further you get from those bigger cities, you'll see a very pro-United Russia, that's Putin's party, population, and then communist and nationalistic political viewpoints as well. Okay, it's kind of like the USA regional split, and a lot of the population still believes President Putin has been a great leader and brought Russia back to economic prosperity and worldwide power, prestige, and influence. Okay, so be careful. Don't underestimate Russia. So that was last week's. I repeat, I think it's very important for you to hear that. On page 81 is the beautiful map of Russia, of Kiev and the Ukraine. And, okay, so I'm starting to read. Bottom of page 81, Ukraine is 818 miles wide. Well, it's bigger than I thought, east to west. That's the distance from New York City to Chicago. You can see how different the people might be on each side of that country. It's probably more like two countries. And it became part of the Soviet Union in 1922 or so, until 1992. It's intertwined culturally and economically with Russia. It's the home of two former Soviet Communist General Secretary leaders from 1954 to 83, Nikita Khrushchev and Leonid Brezhnev. Yes, indeed. Far western Ukraine, the city of Lviv, is located alongside Poland, became part of the Ukraine in 1945, and is the primary source of the far right-wing neo-Nazi ideology and violence, anti-Russian hatred, and very influential in the new Kiev Ukraine government, or so I'm told and read. The region was part of Poland from approximately 1920 to 45, and historically a European mixture of Ukrainians, Poles, Germans, Romanians, and Jews. It remains to be seen how this Ukrainian issue will play out. And remember, I wrote this 3 years ago. Okay, this is not a current news story. I will tell all of you this: Russia will never allow Ukraine to be part of NATO and align with the West, and will never leave Crimea, as we can see that today, the red lines. There are two issues that could result in a major military conflict. Interestingly, Russia has a major naval base in Sevastopol, its only domestic warm water port, and it must have this for self-defense strategic purposes. It's by far and away gigantic. Russia is also building another naval port, or a smaller naval refueling place on Russian soil at the east end of the Black Sea. So the world is actually safer now that Russia feels a sense of security. It will not lose this critical base in Crimea on the Black Sea. Inadvertently, it's probably been better, but nobody would look at it that way, except me. Crimea also was part of Russia for several centuries and has a substantial majority Russian population. President Khrushchev gave Crimea to Ukraine in 1953 as a goodwill gift in response to Stalin's terrible starvation of Ukraine in the 1930s. Of course, he starved his own people too. Ukraine has always been fought over and subdivided. In about 1675, that's a long time ago, Poland and Russia split Ukraine. The Ottoman Empire, the Turks, occupied it, and many Western Ukrainians joined with Germany during World War II. The eastern Donbass and Luhansk region, about 5% of the country, for all practical purposes, is now a Russian protectorate. It's Donetsk and Luhansk. Russia is providing financial assistance to rebuild the country and aid after the destruction of a bloody civil war between the separates and the Ukrainian army. At that time, 10,000 people were killed, mostly civilians. Now it's up to 14,000. Okay. The currency, I understand, is now in Russian rubles, and the official language is Russian. Most or all of those people have been offered Russian passports, become Russian citizens if they choose. From time to time, Russia is the official language there, by the way, in those provinces. Ukraine has cut off electrical power there from time to time and held back people's pensions in this region intermittently. Russian military forces, this is what they say, and I tend to believe this. So, as we say, Russian military forces only entered Ukraine to push back the advancing Ukrainian army that was slowly defeating the separatists. This is in the summer of 2014, in August. Now, the artificial border is stable, but some artillery are still exchanging fire. A compromise must be reached based on realism and not idealistic notions. So, Russia is here to stay as a world power, and it must be dealt with at worst as a rival with different viewpoints in history, and at best as a strategic partner solving particular world problems according to international law. Remember this, Russia is called the Russian bear, and it surely has happened now. Very aggressive and powerful if provoked, and is being gradually pushed further into a corner. 3 years ago it was. And if someone is waving their hands, teasing and taking the bear's food, sooner or later that bear will come at you furiously and fight back. NATO, the USA are playing with fire, creating a very risky and dangerous situation and don't even realize it. This is what I am trying to tell you. This is a warning of what might happen under unforeseen circumstances. It appears to be happening. My Russian business friend, lawyer, told me that Russia will never back down and knows how to suffer and survive, and I believe it. One should not be distracted by the internal policies of the Russian government, which you may not agree with, because they do not meet American and liberal ways of doing things. They may seem rough at times and without as much due process. You may not approve, but it is Russia and it is different from the West. The section of the book is only about the evolving Russian foreign policy point of view and the conflict with the USA and NATO. It's also not about President Putin. At the time was President Trump. Okay, here's what I have surmised since watching the 2014 Maidan in Kiev on TV in 2014 and reading numerous articles, books, TV shows, and internet communications from Eastern Europe and Ukraine. Maidan was a very well-intentioned movement by sincere Ukrainian people for a better life, a higher standard of living, like seen in Poland, Hungary, and Germany. But Ukraine has particular problems that make this goal difficult, and it hasn't changed. I admire their courage. To become more independent and economically sustainable is important. But the country is still run by special interests and oligarchs, and has not changed much since before 2014. So go ahead and subscribe to the pro-Russian internet newsletter. It's called Slavyanka. I don't think it's published anymore, but you can internet it. Slavyanka. It is published in Canada by a Ukrainian. See the other viewpoint. It won't hurt you. Then decide what you believe. Here I saw the battle lines, pictures of a combat, speeches by local leaders in Russian and Ukrainian viewpoints, which you'll never see in the mainstream media. Some of you will be upset with me, but this is just one viewpoint. It just needs to be expressed. Then you choose what you think is preferable to yourself and what you really believe. But you gotta get all the viewpoints. That's the point of this whole thing, this entire book. Okay, consider it and debate it. Victoria Nuland, the U.S. Assistant Secretary of State for European and Eurasian Affairs at that time, and appointed by President Obama, stated publicly the U.S. has invested over $5 billion in Ukraine since 1991 for humanitarian purposes, infrastructure, and to influence its government and population to become pro-Western and anti-Russian. There was what's called an Orange Revolution there. In 2000, I don't know, 4 or 10 in that range. And the U.S. has put in $5 billion in the last 6 years of military hardware. And we can't get dental care approved for senior citizens here. Okay. So with this gigantic investment, it's no wonder that the U.S. is trying to keep Ukraine friendly to Western Europe and NATO. They have the power to protect their client, the client being Ukraine. That's what it seems like. So it will achieve their goals and not waste this huge sum. Wouldn't you? She is married to Robert Kagan, the major neocon thinker who considers Russia a major military threat that must be subdued. I listened to her conversation with Jeffrey Pyatt, the U.S. ambassador to Ukraine, in March 2014, and that was widely dispersed on the internet. And again, the picture's on page 84. It says, Victoria Nuland on the phone with U.S. ambassador to Ukraine, picking next interim Ukraine Prime Minister after the February change in the Kiev government. Arseny Yatsenuk in the middle, who was the U.S. choice. Yes, he's in the middle. I made a mistake earlier in this. It's just amazing. They're just sitting there waiting to be selected passively. It says so much. It really does not make the U.S. look very good, and I don't see how they can say the U.S. wasn't involved encouraging and choosing the future government of the Ukraine. At this meeting with three potential Ukrainian leaders present, they discussed who would be the first interim president of Ukraine. Victoria, she has high ideals, but is also influenced by the ideas of the deep state, or what I call the deep vapor, the neocons. She feels an obligation to promote liberal democracy everywhere the U.S. is called or thinks it must intervene. During this violent time, dissidents from Western Ukraine arrived to encourage violence and an immediate change in government. In essence, a revolution. I saw Ukrainian government police on fire from Molotov incendiary cocktails thrown at them from the Maidan crowd. So it wasn't all violence going one direction. Yes, the police fired and injured demonstrators, but they seemed primarily defensive, using shields and armored vehicles to block advancing crowds who were trying to occupy government buildings. Didn't the U.S. military shoot and kill 200 Kent State innocent college students in 1970? Violence gets out of hand when demonstrations break out into riots. Large piles of tires were ignited by the demonstrators, causing massive fires and chaos. Violence intensified as mercenary private armed fighters from the western Ukraine area arrived, where intense anti-Russian existed, attitudes that is. This is a region much less Russian and mostly Central European in culture, ethnicity, and just you can see it in a travel movie of Lvov on the internet. It doesn't look quite as Eastern. Yes, the police fired and hurt protesters, but the protesters had occupied government buildings and armed fighters were intermingled with the Maidan protesters. There is some good evidence that they incited the severe violence and had snipers shooting both the government police and the protesters to inflame conflict. The statistics, as I see, protesters, they had a militia of 12,000, the government law enforcement 8,000. Those are the number of people in those groups. The casualties, the protesters 266 killed and missing, 1,100 wounded. The government 13 killed, 339 wounded. The total civilian protesters, they said, was up to 800,000. Okay, it's complicated, but in March 2014, an agreement was reached and signed between, this is important now, just listen to this, between the Ukrainian government and Maidan rebels. Several European countries, Germany, France, Poland, and Russia, were observers. It was to provide a compromise peace plan and hold free elections in December 2014. Peace and normal daily life was to recommence. The government was not to use its militarized police against civilians. The political status quo would remain until the November elections. However, this agreement was not implemented, and the Ukrainian government at that time fled the country under duress as violence against the existing government continued to erupt, with anti-Russian militias surrounding key government buildings, rampaging through Kiev, and trying to capture the president and his staff. It's like some kind of movie. Right? A new government was then voted into office by the Rada, that's the Ukrainian parliament, R-A-D-A, 280 to 0. Wow. But many members who opposed this change were not present. They were hiding out. Might have been 100 or more of them. Okay. Others were afraid to dissent. A new government elected itself into office that was extremely anti-Russian, encouraged by the USA. Many people besides the Russian government consider this a violent coup or forced, non-democratic change of government. Shortly thereafter, the Ukrainian army invaded the eastern Donbass rebellious regions that were closely aligned with Russia, and a major war began, which lasted 2 years then. Now it's lasted, 7? At that time, the U.S. Central Intelligence Agency director visited Kiev. Sadly, there are those who believe the U.S. government supported this questionable illegal change of government and encouraged the Ukrainian strong military response. Wouldn't be the first time. The new Ukrainian president said the Donbass region was in for a nasty surprise in June 2014. Okay, I read that. The Ukrainian army attacked the Donbass rebel-controlled region, resulted in massive fighting in over 3 cities and a strategic airport. This was Luhansk, Donetsk, and Mariupol. Mariupol is occupied still by the Ukrainian forces. The U.S. supported this attack quietly. Russian troops were not present, perhaps only as advisors and a very small contingent of volunteers. And yes, Russia eventually responded with its voluntary militia to push back Ukrainian military units and protect and bring peace to the unfortunate civilians in that area. Russia did not unilaterally invade Ukraine, okay, on their own. The Ukrainian army came first, all right? Their security forces may have helped the Donbass rebels assert themselves and create protests against the current government. This is in the spring of 2014. The U.S. would do the same thing. The U.S. Central Intelligence Agency would do the same thing. I have a page to go. As part of its mission in the world since World War II. I have seen in the internet from numerous sources, photographs, videos, original articles in detail that illustrate this civil war. I have seen a woman with the leg blown off reaching out in anguish trying to get a cell phone to call her daughter before she died. And excuse me, she was hit by Ukrainian shell fire. I've seen destroyed buildings, civilians running to hide in fear as the Ukrainian artillery bombarded their own cities and citizens, seemingly to punish them and force them to submit. The separatists inadvertently were probably doing the same, but they were being pushed in from the outskirts. Okay. In Odessa, another major Russian city, a group of Russian civilians were locked in a building and burned alive by a group of Ukrainian far-right militia disguised as civilians. Yes, both sides created destruction, but the Ukrainian army was the primary attacker before the Russian voluntary paramilitary intervened to push back the Ukrainian army and protect the Donbass cities and people. Yes, and I talk about the M-17 passenger plane. Basically what I think happened, Ukraine had a small air force they were using and bringing in supplies and things with large aircraft, and so several of those Buk 300, 400 anti-aircraft missile launchers were put into the separatist area. The separatists weren't trained very well on them, and they inadvertently shot down this plane. It wasn't purposeful. It was the fog of war, I'm afraid to say. It's too bad. It's terrible. But if there wasn't a war in the first place, this wouldn't have happened. If Ukraine hadn't pushed out the separatists and tried to attack them, there wouldn't have been a conflict there. And if the USA hadn't been pushing Ukraine and encouraging it silently, which I believe they have, maybe it wouldn't have happened. Terrible. Okay, there's more detail there for you to read on page 86. Okay, I've seen, I have a big picture on page 87 of Ukrainian volunteer soldiers wearing, Nazi swastikas and things on their uniforms and a flag and a symbol. Okay. I have seen numerous pictures and videos of quasi-independent Ukrainian military units from Western Ukraine with Nazi swastikas and lightning bolt insignias on their uniforms, which were worn by the Nazi SS stormtrooper elite troops that reported directly to Hitler in World War II. It is a fact that many men in Western Ukraine fought alongside the German army against the Russian and Ukraine armies at that time. These two current army units are the Right Sector in central eastern Ukraine and the Azov, AZOV battalion in Mariupol by the Black Sea. But they also favor a strong nationalistic autocratic government that is not aligned with the West so much. Interesting. And replaces the current one in Kiev. It is complicated. And here's a picture of them. Take a look. Okay, that's about it for today, and I'll have a little bit more to say about Ukraine in video 7, about what actually happened in Odessa, some pictures of the flaming buildings, and my background being raised by a Ukrainian stepfather. It won't be as long as this one, and that'll sum it up. Okay, so come on back. Help me, help yourself. If you like this, subscribe. I'm not going to make any money, but it's going to help spread the word. And if you get that e-draft book copy, you can send it out to people. Just get the word out there. You know, I make peanuts on selling books, and I'll never have enough viewers to make any advertising revenue. So you could call this a hobby, but it's something I'm committed to for the betterment of everybody. All right, I'm signing off. I'll see you next time. Bye-bye.